This is Crochet Inspired Embroidery for Quilts. We're going to use the glue basting Piec-Lique technique to turn this into a quilt top. This will be a full series of classes on completing this quilt. As a quilter, I always think about whatever I'm working on, how it would work in a quilt. That was secondary to my focus for actually doing this embroidery. And then I had this, I would say, a happy accident. I stitched out some full motifs, and I had prepped my hoop correctly, and I used a pressing cloth to finish it, and for some reason I didn't remove the pressing cloth, and it went clear through the whole stitching process. And when I tried to pull it off the hoop, my pressing cloth was on the back of the embroidery, and I was very upset, very upset. I thought, well, we'll just go ahead and wash them. When this came out of the wash and we dried it, it was amazing. Now, I've tried many different techniques to actually get the embroidery into my quilting. Never have I ever had it this flexible. What causes problems in the quilting is how stiff the piece is, and it never looks alive like a regular quilt. Where with this, it will absolutely flow with whatever I want to put in a quilting piece. And I've done quilt in the hoops, I've done all of those things, and I've never ever been happy with the finished results because of the stiffness. And with this process, this one specifically, I used 2 pieces of the water-soluble stabilizer, and it worked out really great. For this project, we're using 3002 collection that will be released soon. So I have 2 pieces here, and I wanted to show you how to get it ready for the next process. And with all of the pieces, you're going to get these little tails. I extended that line around to the start of the next one. It's going to be these points right here that we need to stabilize, and we need to make sure that they're secure, or else the piece will actually unravel. So I'm going to turn it over, and you can actually see it a little bit better. And I'm using a product called Liquid Stitch for this. And if you look at these points right here, you can see that the top thread pulls to the back, which is normal in embroidery. So we want to put a little dot of glue right there. Okay? And I push it in. We put another one. I want to make sure that it catches both threads. Now, fray check, any of those really doesn't work as well as Liquid Stitch for this process. You want it a little bit thick. You don't want it to bleed everywhere. So what I'm doing is securing the stitches so they won't fray. Right there. And right there. The piece actually has knots, but that doesn't mean it's really going to hold through the quilting process. You want to make sure that's taken care of. And I put a pressing cloth on top because I don't really want to get my iron dirty. So I put my pressing cloth on top, and we want to press the Liquid Stitch to push it into the fibers correctly, because you don't want it sitting on top. You want to put it deep into the actual stitch. So we've got that ready to go. Now, before you start picking anything out, what I need you to do is take your little seam ripper, and right next to the stitch, not catching, do not use your scissors for this. You want to cut that thread. And see how I've cut it right there? And we're going to do it here. And one of the reasons why we're doing it this way is that you've secured it on the back, and now we're cutting it on the front. And you put enough Liquid Stitch on the back so that it won't undo on itself. So we cut these right here. So cutting that top thread makes it easier to pull your thread out. And see how it just pulls right out? And do not cut the back, the bobbin thread. You want to leave that. The reason why you want to leave that bobbin thread is that adds a little bit of security. If both the top and the bobbin thread are cut in the same spot, they will unravel. But if one's longer than the other, it won't unravel. I pulled it all the way back, just like that. And you've already glued it, so you don't need to do any more. And I'm going to go ahead and pull it out, and that loosens that thread on top. So we have everything ready. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over. And you want to make sure that your thread is pulled back out of the space in between. Like this one, we want to make sure that it's pulled out. And keep that nice and clean there. So you can do this with a rotary cutter or a pair of scissors, but you want to rough cut. You want to rough cut your piece at least, I'd say 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch bigger than the actual design. So you can do it with a rotary cutter. I get a little scared that I'm going to hit the embroidery, but if you're good with a rotary cutter, you could go ahead and cut it out. And it's just a rough cut. You just want enough room on the outside to actually handle this piece, because if it's just 1/4 of an inch, you're not going to be able to do what you need to do with it. Now this piece I've already turned and prepared it for the class. On the inset piece, we're going to turn 2 of the outside pieces that are next to each other. So we're going to turn this edge and we're going to turn this edge like that. The next process, we need to use starch. And your thought process would normally be we're just going to starch the whole piece, but we're not going to want to do that. You want to spray starch in a container, and you can use the lid or a jar. A jar is kind of good because you can actually put the lid on and store it. If you are going to do that, store it in your refrigerator because it does get mold on it if it's been there a long time. I've used polyester bobbin in this. Now, when you're doing the next step, what happens when you press polyester or washed polyester, any of the things that you do with the actual quilt block to get it ready, the polyester shrinks and it pulls. So many of you have done embroidery and it's got lots of tight spaces in it and it looks really wrinkly and ruffly. The problem you have is your bobbin thread, because the polyester is what's doing that. Now, because I've used polyester on this, you're going to see one side actually shrink up a little bit more than the other side, because one side's on the straight grain and the other side's on the cross grain. So this has been actually stitched out on grain, but one side is the length grain and one side's the width grain. I'm going to take starch, and you do not want to press the whole thing. The last thing that you want to do is get something into your quilt that you have to get out later. So we're just going to put a little bit of starch just where you're going to press. You don't have to be as careful as I am. I'm just over exaggerating so that you will understand how important it is. You can even use a bigger stencil brush. Now, can you see how it's kind of rippling right there? After I did most of the blocks for this project, I started using rayon in my bobbin. Huge difference. There is no puckering at all. A natural fiber like rayon, most people don't even know it's natural, but it is. It's made from wood. It doesn't buckle like this. So you can see the ripples. Let me turn it on this side. And it's actually less ripples on this side. And that's with using polyester. If you use rayon in the bobbin, you have no problems there at all. So I might suggest that. Now, if this is what you like, just know how to handle it. We have our starch on the side. And to press these things, you've got to use a towel. So we're going to get a towel so I can show you how to actually press these pieces. So when you're pressing anything that has embroidery on it, you want to use a little bit more of a cushion kind of thing. And I found the towel works the best. If you were to press this on a flat, hard surface, which is normally what I use, it will press the actual embroidery down. We're going to press this piece. Now, because I use the polyester, I've got to handle it different. If it were with the rayon in the bobbin, it wouldn't be any of this process. I am taking it and I'm stretching it as I'm pressing. Normally, I wouldn't recommend the stretching, but as you can see, now it's straight. So we want to go ahead and press the other side. And these are the two edges that we're going to turn. So the next process, because we now have our fabric stiff, you want to go back to the normal pressing surface, which is a little bit harder. And how I actually handle this is I do the whole batch of whatever it is and get those edges starched. And because they're starched, we can fold that edge back. I like to have the edge, which is where we're going to press that line, towards me, so I can see where the actual embroidery is. So we have it facing towards me. Once you fold that fabric over, you can't tell because it's under the fabric. You don't want to put any more starch on. You just want to press a crease. And you can see what that looks like on this side. And that way you're lining it up with the embroidery. So we'll go ahead and do the other side that's been starched. And like I said, to really decide which side to starch, you're going to have to play with the actual pieces once they're stitched out and figure that out. It's real easy. I line that up, and we don't worry about the corner. What we're doing here is actually getting a stitching line. It isn't going to do anything more than that. Now we have the edges pressed, and that gives you just a stitching line. That's all that's there for. And now it is ready for the next process. We're working with what is called a 3-square, and this is a 3-square with a border. And this edge right here is what needs to be turned, this one. I've finished all the starts and stops, so they're all taken care of. And now I'm going to turn it over and get it ready for the starching and the Piec-Lique. We've got to turn these edges right here. In doing that, that means I have to cut a line so I can turn those edges back. Where we're going to have the problems is right here, because I need to split it. So we need to make that area stable, which means that the fabric won't fray. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to starch this whole area, get that good and dry, and then we're going to put some liquid stitch right over the fabric and a little bit over the actual embroidery, and then we're going to turn the edges. So we want to get our starch, and you want to repeat the same process, putting starch just on the fabric, remember it's going to pucker because of the polyester bobbin. We have put our starch on, not pressed yet. We put it on top of the towel, and you want to go ahead and do the same thing. You want to press until it's dry. Okay, we want to use our liquid stitch, and I'm going to make sure I catch just the inside of the embroidery and pull it out for the fabric. I like to push it into the fabric so it's not sitting on top, and then you can put your pressing cloth on top of that and press. So this now is ready to turn the edges. We want to clip on the bias right down to the embroidery. And because we secured those fibers, when I turn it, it won't fray. So we want to make sure that we clip right down to that. And when you get started on the pressing, make sure you can see the little edges, the little connectors on the embroidery. And we're going to press that edge down. And I want to get right into that corner. You can see right there, there's no fraying. So it's how you handle that corner that actually helps you do this process. So we take and turn this next corner in the same way. And make sure that you get it turned right up next to that embroidery. And because it is secured with the glue, you're not going to have any problem with the turning process. And remember that the actual fibers right here is secured with the liquid stitch. So they're not going to fray out when you do the sewing. So I want to show you how the rayon in the bobbin creates a balance in your stitch from the top to the bottom. You can have the same tension balance, all of that, but the different fibers really make a huge difference. When I got this piece from Neil when he washed it, it was laying nice and flat without any pressing. But to get ready for the next process, I pressed everything, and this barely needed anything. Where the ones with the polyester needed blocking and all sorts of things to get them ready. I've ripped a 3.5-inch piece of fabric, cross grain. I need to starch it to get it ready for the next step. And when you're starching, you want to starch one side and press it on the other. We really only need one starching on this. You don't need as much as you would use for the hooping process. We just want it to be stable and the grain lines controlled. And you want to press it till it's dry. And remember, press it from the back side of where you sprayed the starch so it doesn't flake on you. You can turn it over and press it on the other side to help it dry. You don't need to starch it again. Just once is enough. So we have that piece ready to go. And what this is going to be is the little stars that points on our block. So we want to cut it. It actually needs to be just 3.5-inch squares. And you can just cut it with your rotary or rip it. So we're now working on this corner. And with glue basting Piec-Lique, we want to get units ready so we can sew them in a consecutive order. I've starched and pressed about a 3.5-inch square. It can be rough, doesn't have to be exact. So we've starched and pressed it, and now we're going to glue baste this piece to the fabric. It really doesn't matter which edge you use. You just want to make it open. This actual fold line is for the next step. So we open that up. So I'm going to turn it back over. And we want to use Elmer's school glue. And this is the liquid school glue. And you can get these tips on my daughter's website. It's really important to use the right tip. If you just use it straight from the bottle, you're going to get way too much glue on the piece. So you want to make sure you use a fine tip. So I want to put a line of glue. We want a fine line, and you want a line of glue right on that fold. And this is basic glue basting. That's all this is. And it's to replace the process of pinning. So we're going to secure that. And you want to place it very much in the center. Give yourself plenty of room on the other side, but pretty much in the center. And we press it down with your hand, get it ready to go, and then you want to heat set that. Now the heat setting is really important. If you just glue and leave it unset, it's not going to be strong enough to be actually sewn. And what's happening when you're doing this is you're stabilizing the grain lines, not just getting ready for the sewing. That glue basting actually acts like a stay stitch. So it stabilizes all the grain lines, so it will not move under the needle. When you're doing the sewing, what will happen if you have this depth, which is what embroidery creates, is a depth of thread, next to the needle, it'll kind of shift on you. So you want to make sure that it's glue basted so that you can sew very accurately. We want to get all 4 of these units ready to go. we're going to glue baste the other 3 pieces. We've prepped all of the corners, so now we've got to prep the actual center right here. To prep that, we want to turn back the edges in this triangle. As you can see, we want to turn back these edges to get ready for this row. We need to prep this unit, and it's a triangle unit, and I'm going to starch these 2 edges right here. All right, so we want to turn that over, and I'm going to put starch on it. We want to starch that edge. We want to turn back to get our sewing line. Make sure you can actually see those little points. We're going to sew this piece and eventually this side of the piece together to create the points. You can actually see a grain line, so we want to match those 2 grain lines like that. And we're going to get a creasing line in it. And what we're doing here is getting the true bias. So we want to fold 4 of these to get them ready for the process. We have the fold in the middle, and we're going to put this piece and glue it down to that piece. And you want to make sure you kind of center it. So pull that out, and that gives your alignment for the actual piece. So if you're looking at your pattern, that's what we're doing right here. So we're going to glue this edge. And what's important is all of this excess, so don't cut all that off. We're going to have to sew these seams with a zipper foot because of the bulk on the embroidery. So you want to make sure you have enough fabric on both sides to make sure that you can hold it properly under the needle. We're aligning it with the true bias, so we know that it's going to work really well. You kind of press it from the top just to get it set a little bit, and then turn it over and press. What we're going to prepare next is part of the actual border. I have this piece and this piece and this piece. We're not going to mess with this piece yet. We want to just do these pieces, and we're going to do all 4 units for the border. I've already starched and turned the outside pieces. The next step is to glue baste for Piec-Lique these pieces onto the center. You want to put a fine line of glue on that fold. And that's what makes it glue basting, is that instead of hand basting or pin basting, you're using glue, and this is Elmer School glue, so it completely comes out. So we want to line up all the connectors. Make sure they're lined up really nicely. And I just kind of touch it a little bit to get it to set. We go ahead and do the other side, and then I'll turn it over and press. You put a line of glue, not dots, you need a line. And then we want to turn the whole unit over and press from the back to set the glue basting. Okay, this now is ready for the sewing process. We're going to be sewing these seams right here. And we're also going to be sewing the seams, and this is the border, these seams right here on all of the pieces. You want to set up your machine with a zipper foot, and this is a really important part because you don't want to actually sew over any of the embroidery. I use a little bit wider zipper foot. If you have that available, it's fine, but whatever your machine has will work. I use embroidery needles for all my sewing. The reason why is it's a ball point. With a ball point, it actually pushes the fibers away as it sews. A sharp cuts the fibers. If your needle hits a fiber, if it's a sharp, it actually will cut through it as opposed to move it aside. So I only use ball point. For my actual stitching, and I do this with all of my pieces, I use Aurifil, and it's 50/2, and it's the 100% cotton. So you want a natural fiber. If you use polyester for piecing, you're going to have a lot of puckering at the seams. I use the Aurifil in the top thread and in the bobbin. You want to use a 2-stitch length. I actually like to have it just a little bit smaller than the 2. I want to be able to stitch it so when you have your seam allowances at 1/4 of an inch, you're getting 5 holes and 3 stitches within that space. The reason for that stitch is that when you are cutting them apart, it actually unties itself at least 2 stitches. So if your stitch length is a little bit shorter, you won't have the problems with the piece actually pulling apart. So we have our glue basted piece. Now we're going to do Piec-Lique. And you just fold it over. And as you can see, there's an actual fold line. And that fold line is where you sew. You have a pressed in marking for the sewing process. We want to start the stitch, and I always start really far up so I can gauge it just a little bit. There will be just a little bit of bulk at this point of the embroidery. So you want to be kind of careful until you get used to it, because you can see how it kind of rolls up. And because we have that pressed line, there's no question where to sew, and it also is stable to the background piece. So we want to sew clear through. So I backstitch just a little bit. I just don't want to worry about it. So we want to repeat the same process, and we're going to string piece it. Make sure you're getting really close to those connection points and follow the line. We're going to take a moment and talk about the stitching. You can see the stitch line is very straight. The reason it's straight is that we glue basted it, so you have created a stable environment for that stitch to stay straight. It also comes right next to the embroidery. There's no buckle out on it. And if you were to use a normal piecing foot, you wouldn't have this kind of control. But with that zipper foot and the wider allowance, that gives you the control because you can hold on to it and not allow it to kind of shift under the needle. So I wanted to point that out. I also want to show you the other side. And I wanted to show you the actual sewing when it's done. You can see that that seam is right up next to the embroidery and it's perfectly straight. There's no wobbles in it. So this system works really well, whether or not you're working with embroidery or just a difficult block. It helps a lot to keep things together. What I also need to mention while we're focusing on that is that we do not leave all of this. At this point, we can cut it to your 1/4 inch seam allowance. So all of this is a handle for you. So you have control over the fabric under the needle. The glue basting Piec-Lique allows you to sew through bulk and maintain your alignment. If you were to use pins to hold that into alignment under the needle, it adds to the bulk. The pin will move the fabric in a kind of an S shape and your alignment will go off under the needle. So we don't want to use pins at all for this technique. The bulk right here is where you need to be really, really careful as you do the sewing. While we're sewing, you want to make sure that you're holding on to that bulky area before it hits the foot. So I'm going to sew up to that area and then I'll show you why you want to do that. Okay, can you see how this is lifting? That is that bulky area. So you want to make sure you're holding on to it really tight. Now you have to trust that you glue basted it properly, but you don't want it to flip up into your needle. So you want to hold on to it and stitch. And that's even more why we need a bigger seam allowance, because you wouldn't be able to grab onto it if we didn't have this big seam allowance. And you can see how thick it is. If we had not used the glue basting, it would not have worked at all. It would have been unpicked constantly. All right. These bulky areas, it's really important to double check yourself because you may have it shift just a little bit. Let's go ahead and look. So as you can see, these alignments are very nice. They're very good. We're going to go ahead and stitch those remaining pieces. next step is going to be to trim the actual seam allowance and press. When you're working with a traditional pieced block, normally you want to press towards the dark. And we also want to do that. You don't want it to shadow through this light background. So we want to press it towards the dark. But what's really important is how you're going to quilt it. So when we do the quilting, we want to get in here and quilt. So we want a little bit of a ledge right here to do the quilting. So you have to think of both things and how you want to handle your particular type of sewing. You can use a rotary cutter if you like, but we want to cut it to 1/4 inch. And I like it just a little bit skinnier than 1/4. It's just more flexible. Now what's important when you're sewing seams on any quilt is to have the seams stable and they're not stretching. But also you want to have them to where they line up next to each other so that when you quilt, you're not going to get some weirdness. I'm going to actually press this towards the dark. And we want to press from the back. And this is really important to press from the back because you just don't want to put a weird shine on the embroidery. You want to go ahead and press from the back. If it fusses at you, you can use a little bit of starch. See how that's kind of sticking up a little bit? You can put a little bit of starch, but you can also just put a little bit of moisture. Let's put a little bit of starch. And what we're doing is reactivating that starch that was there. And now we want to press that. We want to go ahead and do that with all these pieces. This one will also be pressed to the dark. So we'll do it with all these pieces. We want to go ahead and trim to a scant 1/4 inch. And when you're trimming like this, you're actually creating a very solid seam, so it doesn't shadow through very well at all. So it's when you have a dark going against the light that you have it. Now with this one, because we're working on a traditional block, we're going to fold that seam back towards the dark, and you may have to activate your starch again, and you can just use water to do that. This piece is just a little bit different. There's no dark in it at all because it's the same background to each other. When I do the quilting, I want to go ahead in these areas and do just a light stipple in these areas to push it back or recede it back so that this area of the embroidery will lift forward. To do that, we've got to open those seams. We don't want to press on one side or the other because that creates a little ledge that the stipple doesn't look even on. When you're getting ready to do the pieces that you're going to want the seam to be invisible, you need to do an open seam. When you have stitched it correctly with that small stitch, it's just fine to go ahead and do that. So we want to take our seam allowance and you want to pull it apart. So the glue basting now is pulled apart so you can get a really nice open seam. And now we can get an open seam. So you want to pull these apart and then trim to your 1/4, and then we're going to press them open. Now if you had trimmed these before you pulled it apart, it would have been very difficult to do so. So if we've got these all pulled apart with that big seam allowance, then they're very easy to open. So we want to trim these to the scant 1/4. And then we want to open those seams. And you're going to have to reactivate your starch with a little bit of water. You know, just don't put water straight on it. You can just use your stencil brush to put just a little bit at the seam. So if you're having problems with your regular sewing and the seams aren't laying flat, you can actually do that on any kind of sewing. So we've activated it. I'm going to just kind of hold it open. And because I need to press on the whole thing, I'm going to use a pressing cloth. I want to make sure I've not created any kind of issues. So put a pressing cloth on it. And the pressing cloth actually draws up that excess starch, so it helps it to work really well. So we have an open seam. And if you turn it over, you can press it again. I don't like going straight on because I don't want to mash the embroidery, but I'll just catch it in those spots. There you go. What happens with this, I used hand dyes on the back, so they're just a little bit different color. But what happens when you do the quilting, I'll be using a very light aqua. So when I go in and quilt it, it will completely disappear with the quilting on top. You want to go ahead and do all the seams. And I'm going to trim them all and then press them all. These two pieces are what we need to work on next. I've already pressed a line in, but we don't have a line on the actual seam allowance, so you need to create that. And it also needs to be starched. So we're going to put a little bit of starch on this corner. Right here. Go ahead and take care of this one too, right here. When you do the corner, you want to take your seam allowance and kind of match it so we get a nice line. Can you see how I'm matching my seam allowance there? We'll go ahead and press that. You want to turn it over and press. And match your seam allowance. And what matching your seam allowance actually does for you is you don't get that curl in the corner. So we want to match our seam allowance and press. And we pressed our 3.5 inch pieces already. So those pieces now, we can glue this to that fold line. Just like that. And then we'll sew those seams. So we have our fold line, and this is 3.5, and you just match the grain lines like that. So when I rip it, I didn't rip it real consistent. You'll probably cut it with your rotary and do it a bit more consistent. You want to put a fine line on the fold. And we match the fold line, just like that. I'm going to just lightly tap it to secure it a little bit, and then we roll the thing over and press the back to get the glue dry. And you want to repeat the process with this one. So we have our 3.5 inch piece of fabric that we folded and matched the grain lines or the edges to get our true bias. Want to open that up, and we'll align this like that. So we want to put a line of glue on the fold, and we just want to make sure you center it so it has plenty of fabric on the outside edges. Okay, now turn it over and press the back to set that glue. Okay, now we have those pieces. So we have these pieces now ready to go. You can see those pieces. So it's this piece and this piece. We're going to work on this next row. With this row, we're going to have to sew this seam, and then we'll sew that seam. So we want to do it in sets. So there's a right and a left, and we want to make sure that we have a right and left of both of these. So we have these two pieces that are next. Now we need to get a true bias on these pieces. How we're going to do that is just a little bit different than on the other block. We won't fold it. So we want to get the true bias, and we need to get the bias from these points. And it's very, very simple. You need to have a ruler with a 45-degree angle. And you want to place that ruler, and I have a hard time actually seeing the points. You want to get it to where you can see it. See the 45-degree line. We want to line it up with the seam line. And I have a marking pencil, so I want to mark that line. So once we've marked, we now have a true bias, so we can know where to place that next piece. Normally I wouldn't have that thick of a line, but we're doing it for the camera. So we're going to do a right and a left. To make it really, really clear, I'm leaving this one here. So we want it to go in the opposite direction, so it goes towards this corner. So you want to line up your ruler, matching the tip of the embroidery, and mark your bias. And that marking will be in the seam line, so you'll be fine with that. So we have these two, and we have a right and a left. We've drawn the placement lines on the piece, and now we're going to construct these two rows. We have to do it in steps. We are going to put this piece, and this piece together, and then it's going to be sewn, and then we'll put this piece on for the next one. Here are the lines, and your orientation is this. So you want to make sure that you've got everything ready to go. Now right here, the fabric wasn't turned far enough back, so I'm going to correct that. We're going to correct the seam line. It wasn't folded far enough back. So you want to press it open and go ahead and turn it back. And I want to turn it back until I see that edge. And repress. All right, that's better. And can you see how much better it actually fits now? You can see how it aligns with this point here. So I'm going to put glue on the fold line. You want to align your embroidery with the other embroidery piece. So your alignment is right here. And follow the placement line that you drew. And we're just touching it so that it'll set. And then you want to turn it over and set it on the back. I'm going to do this next one. And the pressing's nice on that one, so we don't need to worry about it. I'm going to put glue on the piece. Just going to touch it to set it so it won't move. And then turn it over. And this now is ready for the sewing. We're going to prepare the top and the bottom borders, which means we are going to glue down the centerpiece to the two corners, and we want to do the top and the bottom. So you'll have two pieces just like this. I like to kind of lay it out, and all you have to do is just roll this over. We're putting glue on the fold line. You want to match your points. And I'm just touching the spots where they match just lightly. One of the reasons why I'm keeping it flat and not just manipulating it, is I want this to dry nicely, and if you kind of yank on it, it's not quite ready to be actually used until I press on the back. So we're putting a line of glue here. Matching all the points. And you want to very carefully turn the whole thing over and press the back. Repeat the same process on the next row. Now that I have both sides done, we're going to go to the sewing machine and sew those seams. We're going to sew the next set of seams, and you want to turn the piece to the back, and then you can open it up. Just like that. And remember, we're going to sew as close as we can to that line. We're going to open the seams and press on the outside border. So you want to open your seams, and then we'll trim it to your scant 1/4 inch. Okay, we want to press the seam open. So while we're working on this piece, we're going to go ahead and press back this top. And remember, we already did the corner, but we have to do the center. So you want to put your starch on. So we want to dry the starch. And remember, you do not want to spray the whole thing. So if you can see right here, the thread just wicks it right up. So you want to be really careful with the starch. All right, so we want to roll the fabric back. Make sure you can see the embroidery. We want to make sure it's good and dry. Okay, we'll move on to the next border. We're going to trim our seams and we're going to press to the dark. And you want to trim to your quarter. Now, you don't have to open it up. And I trim to the quarter. Because this is really thick right here, you want to put a little bit of starch on that, just like that. That will allow it to set the other direction. So I hit it with the iron, and I'm going to put the pressing cloth on it, as we're going to have to press across the actual embroidery. And as you can see, if it's pressed to the dark, it's going to be really easy to go in there and quilt. And then you don't have any shadowing of this corner. So when you're doing traditional, if you just start your little corners and press them, you can actually flip back on itself. And with this one, it's not so thick right in that corner because it's not going back on itself, but you still want to put a little bit of starch on it so it'll lay really flat for the quilting process. Put your pressing cloth on top and press. And I'm giving it just a little kind of pull from the underside so that it'll lay down nice and flat. And as you can see, you have perfect alignment right here. And in the quilting process, you can just ride your needle right next to that edge. We're going to glue baste these pieces together. So we need to draw the alignment line. I always keep the piece next to it so I get the angle going the right direction. So we have that piece, and I'm just going to move it up. And we have our ruler, and you want to lay your 45-degree on the sewing line. And then you want to draw your alignment line right there. This piece is ready to go, except for we have to press that end. So you want to put a little bit of starch on it. I like to keep them in somewhat in the same direction that you're actually going to do the sewing. So I have this all set up and I'm going to turn it over, and we know what side needs the glue. And the important point is this one right here. So we want to make sure we align the seam line to the two connectors right there and align it with your alignment line. And make sure you turn it over. And that sets the glue so it won't move. We're going to glue base the entire border, and then we're going to move on to the stitching. The next thing that we need to do is to glue the inside to the outside pieces to create this row, and we already have that outside rows ready to go. To get ready to do that row of pieces, we need to just turn the outside edge on the top and the bottom. Okay, we want to press this outside edge to get it ready for the turning. So we want to turn the seam allowance and make sure that you turn it so that the embroidery just peeks out just barely from the edge. So the next step is we need to draw the alignment line for this piece. You want to line up your 45-degree line on this fold. And right here is the center, and line up from the center out. And I'm going to do one side at a time, because in the pressing sometimes it gets distorted just a little bit. So just do one side at a time and it will even itself out. If we want to do the opposite side, and this is your alignment for the next piece. You want to repeat that on the other one. We're now ready to do the gluing. We've got everything kind of lined up. You want to flip the one side and we'll put a line of glue on that fold. And you want to match your center first, and then put the fabric over the alignment line. And you want to just tap it a little to get it to set. And we repeat that on the other side. We want to turn it over and set it on the back. So we're now going to move on to the sewing of these pieces. We're going to trim this seam at a scant quarter and press it towards the triangle. Now I know that it is actually lying towards the embroidery, but I'm thinking about how I'm going to quilt it. And I don't want that bulk on the embroidery. I want the same density all the way around the embroidery. So when it quilts, it'll quilt consistently. in the thick areas, which is right here and on the other side. Want to re-starch those points. So with a little water on it, I actually use starch, but a little bit of moisture on it, you can see that it folds really nicely now. Because we have to press over all that embroidery, you want to put a pressing cloth on top. And as you can see, it's going to lay down really nicely. If you have problems with those in your normal quilts, a little bit of starch really works wonders. All right. And we're going to turn it over and press from the front. The reason why I like to press like this is in the quilting process, I want certain areas to be pushed to the back and certain areas lofted. I'm going to quilt radiant lines in the triangles like that. And what happens if you don't have your seams consistent is you're going to have a difference in density on each of the lines. So I really like them to be consistent. So I always fold it so that those lines will have the same density on all of them. So the next thing we're going to do is press these edges. And because we're working in an area that doesn't have any embroidery, I need to put guidelines from this point to this point. I'm using a smaller ruler for this. I don't need the 45 degree. I just need to draw a line for the pressing line from one point to the other. So I'll know where to put the fold line. So we've got that line to that line. So I've got from this point to that point, from that point to that point. We're now ready to do the pressing. Right, so we want to dry the starch. That helps to go over the seams too, as if they're starched down nicely, so it won't be really bulky. Okay, so I want to take that edge, and you can see the drawn line. That's where your fold line. Now I like to have it just slightly to the back side so it doesn't show when you're doing the stitches. And it really, really helps to have that line there. And we'll want to do the other side. And we're now ready to glue it to the other 2 rows. We're going to trim scant quarter and we want to press it towards the triangle. We're going to glue baste this and then sew the seams. And because we have so many things to line up, I'm going to show you just a little different way to get control of that. I am such a traditional quilter and I love the traditional blocks, but adding embroidery to them, oh my goodness. My heart's really beating. I just love how this looks. I'm really happy with it. I'm going to draw the alignment lines and I think we're okay here. But the line here has to be drawn so I don't scoop it in real weird. So we have our lines and we're now going to place this side on. I want to go ahead and put glue on it. Want to put glue the whole distance. So we'll start with our first point, kind of line that up, and then get to the center here. And when you're working like this, you want to pin it. So I'm pinning it to my pressing surface. And we'll pin this. Okay, and with the iron, we want to just set that seam. And I want to give it a second to dry just a little bit. All right, so we want to go ahead and turn it over and set that seam. And I'm just going to put just a tiny bit of starch all over the area just to block it a little bit. So I'm putting a pressing cloth over it to help block it and then pressing. And that'll set the glue basting so it will lay nice and flat. Let's turn it over and look at the front side. See how beautiful that looks like. Right, we want to go ahead and do the other side. Our next step is to get the backgrounds ready. We're going to starch and prep the fabric so that we can sew those on. Our block is approximately 10 inches. So when you're cutting your background, you want to give yourself 2 inches all the way around. So our background piece is cut at 14 inches. When you're doing the corners like this, we're actually going to be cutting it on the bias. So it's really important to starch because we want to control that bias from stretching. So I'm going to spray. And remember to turn it over so it won't flake on the fabric. And press. We're going to do this 3 times. Want to spray it again with starch and turn it over. And one more time. You want to press until it's dry. This isn't quite dry, so I'm going to just press again. I've trimmed this to a 14-inch square, and now we want to take and match our grain lines. And because I've ripped the piece, I know where the grain lines are. And we want to press it. At the pressing line, you want to cut it. You can rotary cut it, or you can just take scissors and cut down the pressing line. So you want your fabric right side down, and we want to press up a good finger width. It's about 5/8, 3/4 of an inch. You don't want a 1/4 inch. If you try to press it with just a 1/4 of an inch, you're going to get distortion. If it's too skinny, it'll curl on you. So that wide turn is also really, really important. If it doesn't have a good crease, you want to use a little bit of starch again. And I want to fold it in half with the wrong side out because we need a center mark. Okay, so we have the wrong side up. So we want to make sure that you press over a good width, at least 3/4 or so. If you try to press that real small seam, it will curl. So you want to make sure that that's a good size allowance. And just touch it just a little bit more with starch to get a good hard crease. And then we want to get a center line. And the center line is going to help us with the truing up process after this is sewn onto the block. We've glued this seam and this seam, and now we're going to glue this, and we'll sew those all at the same time. Your registration mark right here needs to be on the center. And when you're working with a larger piece, you want to fold it back and put glue on one side at a time. You want to glue one side and press it, and then do the other side. It's just too long of a strip to have control. You'll get glue all over the piece. We want to make sure that the fold line is lined up right at that point. And I'm going to stick a pin in it so it won't move. So we've lined that up. And because it's big, I'm going to kind of pin it down as I go so it won't miss a line. And press it. And we're going to do the other side right now. And I think you can see how much easier it is to do it in two parts. So this is all glued down, and we want to go ahead and turn it over and press it. Okay, so we're going to place this with our center mark. Flip one side. We're going to do just one side at a time. And heat set. Line it up. Double check your seams and your points, and then we're going to move on to the sewing. We have an alignment right here, and it's very hard to see through the fabric, so I just rub it to where I can see a little bit of an edge. That way I know where I'm sewing. You can see a tiny bend right there, and that's where the connector is, so we can sew right up next to it. I put a little bit of pressure on it when it comes up to the machine so it won't shift. You can pull your fabric a little bit, and that'll help sometimes. It's just a matter of taking it slow and knowing that those little edges just need a little extra attention. I've sewn the 2 outside seams, and now we're going to sew the inside seams. At this point, I like to do just a tiny back stitch. There's a lot of stress at those points, and you want to make sure that you hold on to the thicker parts so it doesn't shift. We finished sewing all the seams. The next step is to open the seams and trim them. Okay, we want to open the seams, and we want to trim the seams a scant quarter. Okay, everything's trimmed. Now we're going to press the seams. This seam is an open seam, and the opposite side is also open. As I'm looking at it, these seams can actually just be pressed to the center. We're going to press open the outside seams, and you want to put just a tiny bit of starch at that seam so it will press easily. Go ahead and press your seam open. I'm going to repeat it on the next side. All right, a little bit of starch at those seams will help them to lie flat. We're going to press this seam right here. So remember that on the triangles, we want to make sure that all the seams are pressed towards the center of the triangle so that when I quilt, I can just go around that edge. You always want to start your connector seams. Make sure that they lay flat. And because I'm having to press over the top of all of that stitching, I want to use a pressing cloth. I'm going to repeat on the other seam. Okay, so I'm going to check the front, make sure they're all laying nice and flat. This seam right here needs to be flatter. It's kind of folding over. You want to check for that, and if you just pull on it just a little bit, and then we're going to hit it with the iron. Because of the bulk in the corners, you may have to fuss with it a little bit, and you do that from this side. See how it's kind of buckling just a hair? You want to put just a tiny bit of starch in that corner so it'll turn. And I like to be really careful there because when I'm quilting, if there's bulk in that corner, it will cause kind of a hiccup a little bit. So you want to make sure that they're nice and flat. There's just a little bit of lift in the center, and we want to take care of that before we move on. When we're making a block like this, or any block, your fabric will behave in different ways. It actually, because it's natural, I'm assuming you're working with cotton, it will stretch and pull. So we want to learn to block our pieces when they're small, and it really makes a big difference. So this is very little, it's not much at all, and it really makes a big difference if you do this on the finished piece. You don't want to start blocking everything once it's all sewn together. You want to do it block by block. What I usually do, and this is my pressing cloth, is that I get my pressing cloth nice and wet. Now you don't want it saturated, you want it just nicely wet. And then I fold it in a small piece and I wring it. And what that does is it pushes the water clear through the whole thing. You don't want it dripping, you just want it damp. So now we have a damp pressing cloth. If you have to do it a couple times, that's fine. And what makes this really work is the moisture. So you want to make sure that you get your pressing cloth moist, not your block, your pressing cloth. So I have my moist pressing cloth. We want to press, and what's happening here is it's putting moisture back into the block. Now there's plenty of starch on the block, so you don't need to restarch or anything. You just need to reactivate the starch and make it stay where it's supposed to be. Now you can see how flat it's laying now. Want to make sure all your seams are open where they're supposed to be open. Okay, we're going to repeat that process on the front. But you can see already how it's nice and flat. You want to get your pressing cloth wet again. And then we're activating the starch that's already in the block and pressing it. It just gets a little bit of moisture in it so it'll lay nice and flat. And you can see how this works really well. You don't want to wait till the quilting. You want to take care of it at this point. We want to put the other corners on, and it's repeating the same steps. You want to line up your center mark, and that center mark is also going to help us to put the border on, so you want to make sure you don't press that out. And do this other side. Remember, we can only do one side at a time with a big piece. And we're pressing it. Turn the other side over and glue it. I want to make sure I get that center. Okay, we'll turn that over and set the seam, and then we'll finish the other side. We want to line up our center first. We're sewing the last two seams. We want to make sure that you sew the complete seam. We want to press the last two seams in the center, and these seams are also going to be pressed open, so we need to open the seams, open and trim, and then press. We're going to trim the seams at a scant quarter. We've opened the seams, and now we're going to press open. So you want to starch, put a just tiny bit of starch wherever there's a seam that crosses over. And now we're going to press that open. Turn it over and check and press this side. The next step is to join the border and the middle. With this technique, the middle floats just a little bit, so we have some fabric right here, which is why we wanted the oversized triangles in the corner. And we want to make sure that this measurement right here is the same on all 4 points. So we get it lined up, and remember the fold that we put into the triangle? It's right here, and you want to make sure that your corner is lined up with the fold, just like that, and make sure your centers are lined up. You want to take a ruler and figure out what that measurement is, and it's right at 5/8. And make sure it's at 5/8 on all of the centers. I'm going to put a pin right there so we'll know where that needs to go. So we want to make sure we pin at 5/8 of an inch, however your border fits, but it's right at the 5/8 for this one. And we want to make sure we're lining up the corners. And we have 5/8. So the next thing we need to do is pin them to your pressing surface. So I'm just pinning it because I'm going to flip this up and glue this one side, but we don't want it to shift at all on the sides. If you don't have a pressing board that's big enough, I have a pressing board that I can stick into, you want to just put in the pin this way and one this way and pin it just to itself. So you can't really pin it because it loses its alignment normally. So you can just pin going into each other. That way it won't shift. All right, so we're going to turn this back and put glue all along this line. The alignment is really key with when you press your corners and put that extra pressing line in. That's what makes this really work. If you hadn't done that, it would be very difficult to align it. So you want to make sure that you have that diagonal press line in your corners. That's the key to this whole thing. And we want to put a line of glue just on one side at a time. And when we turn those corners, they are now ready for us for the glue. And we want to place it down and realign the center and the corner, and it aligned very nicely. I'm going to heat set those little areas. Because we're going to glue the whole border on, we want to, in the loose areas or just the fabric areas right here, we want to pin those clear through, not around the actual lace, and you only need a couple of pins. We're working with Elmer's school glue, so it's not very, well, it doesn't stick really intensely. So you want to make sure that this is stable. I'm going to take it now and flip it up like this and set the back side. Okay, we're going to turn the piece and do the next side. I need to measure that corner. Remember, it's 5/8. We want to match the pressed line for the corner and match the center. I want to flip this up just a little bit past the corner because we need to make sure that corner is secure. I'm going to put a little bit more glue on the other side. And line up your center and your corners. Yeah, that lined up really nicely. Line up your corner to your diagonal pressing line. Make sure you press that corner really solidly because we glued both sides. So press that. And then we want to secure it with the pins. We're going to flip it over and heat set the back. Now we'll rotate for the other side. We want to make sure we're at 5/8 and on center. We want to mark our 5/8. We want to make sure that the corners are matching the pressed marking right here. And I'm just going to secure these edges. So we fold it back. You want to make sure that you put a little extra glue on the seam line, not on the other side, as we don't want it to be secured. We just want the seam line. And flip it back and line up your centers and your corners. And heat set. We want to pin the border in place until we set the back. And we flip it over and heat set the back side. That's where you actually set all the glue work that you've done. And we're going to move on to the last border. You want to flip up your last border and make sure you get past that corner just a little bit. We want to put glue, and remember to put a little extra in the corners on the seam allowance. We're going to sew the seams. Now you need to sew one at a time. We want to take out the pins on just the one that you're going to sew on. Leave the pins on all of the others so that they don't pull apart. We want to flip back the one border. And you can see now that that is ready for us to sew, even very nicely up into the corners. If this is pulled up, you can line it up again from the back side and put a little bit more glue on it and press it. This is lined up really nicely. And as you can see, these corners haven't frayed, and that's because we set the corner with the liquid stitch so that it would not fray out. We want to start back just a little bit. And make sure you do a back stitch. And because we use the fray check in the corner, that corner is stable. But once you get into the actual seam allowance, you want to back stitch just a little bit, a couple of stitches. And we want to hit the fold line. Before you sew into this corner right here, you want to make sure it's secure and you want to hold on to it. The machine will pull from the underside, So you want to make sure you have complete control of all the layers. And we're going to sew right up into that corner. Because we're using the zipper foot, you should be able to get right up to that. If you used a regular foot, you wouldn't be able to get in there. Okay, so we're sewing right up to that. Make sure you do a back stitch. And we're going to just sew off. Now with this type of seam work, you want to make sure you start and stop on each of the seams. So you don't want to turn that corner. We're going to sew the next border. You want to make sure you pull out the pins that are holding it. And we flip that back. And we're going to sew this seam. We're going to start the next seam. You want to make sure that corner is secure. And we want to make sure that you're doing a back stitch right in the corner. We've now finished all the seams, and the next thing we need to do is open the seams and press them. There's also one additional thing we need to do in the corner to secure it, because those fibers are very, very close to the edge, and we want to make sure that that's been taken care of. So I'm going to flip this back. We want to open the seam up. We put a tiny little bit of the liquid stitch in the corner, and we want to push it into the fibers. We want to trim to a scant quarter. And we're going to finish that last seam. Open the seams. We're pressing the seams open, and I wanted to explain why we put that little bit of liquid stitch on the corners. I put the liquid stitch in the corners. Why that's important is that while the liquid stitch is still moist, it will actually secure itself to this piece. And that makes a huge difference in the strength of your corners. You want to heat set it, and it actually is just very stiff and secure. You won't have any fraying if you follow those steps. I'm just so very happy. I'm almost in tears, but I'm very happy with the piece. I'm very excited to have this top done. It's been a real long process for me to get the embroidery into a top that it doesn't make it stiff. We're going to go clear through the whole process with this top, the quilting, the binding, everything. So stay tuned for the next video.